I am Mary Ann Moxon, still having technical problems. Sharon Owlett and I will present this much needed webinar on barriers to voting today. I say much needed because I saw another alarming headline this morning asking, is your state at risk of an election meltdown? There have been 200 lawsuits across 43 states this year, and a few are still pending, concerning election procedures during this pandemic. But Virginia is well poised to run a smoother election than many states, and I hope you will learn that today. Please visit our website on the screen here to subscribe to our e-voter newsletter, to join our local league. We now have more than 300 members, and to view our first 3 webinars if you missed them. 2020 provides 2 reasons to celebrate. One good thing in 2020. 100 years of the League of Women Voters and 100 years of women's suffrage for most women in America. Since 1920, the League has been an activist yet nonpartisan organization that never supports or opposes candidates or parties. We believe that people should play a critical role in democracy and that they should be informed voters. We focus on voting rights, civic education, and advocacy. The Williamsburg Area League began in 1963 as the first integrated local league in Virginia. Our last webinar addressed how women of color also fought for suffrage, but many of them never saw the voting booth until after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Please note too that men have been members of the League since 1964. Time for a quick public service announcement. We hope that all voters will wear an I voted sticker on or before November 3rd. These important dates will be repeated at the end of the webinar as well as on our website. If you need to register or update your address, do so before October 13th. If you want to request an absentee ballot to return in person or mail back, the official deadline is October 23rd, but that would be really cutting it close. Halloween is the last day to visit your local registrar's office, wearing a mask preferably, to vote early in person, and you can get a head start now and request an absentee ballot. Both the Virginia Department of Elections and the League of Women Voters encourages voters to apply for absentee ballots now and vote early, either in person at your county's satellite locations or on election day. And I'd like to remind everyone that this entire month is voter registration month. This coming Thursday is National Constitution Day. Finally, do not expect election results on election night. This year, not going to happen. A delay is a good sign that careful counting is taking place. What will we cover today? Now the coronavirus has forced states to overhaul their plans to accommodate the expected deluge of ballots. Nearly every state is expanding vote by mail for the coming election. If they do not make adequate preparations for promptly and accurately counting what could be 60 million mail-in ballots, the ensuing controversy may well rock our democracy to its foundations. There's been a lot of chatter about fraud and rigged elections, and our goal today is to leave you better informed voters as you face some possible barriers to the ballot box. But we want to restore voters' confidence in our election system. Democracy depends on that. Every vote should count. Is our democracy in trouble? Our Constitution gave the administration of elections to the states. So we do have 50 ways to run elections. The author of a recent book on our government writes that some have tried to corrupt our political process for their benefit, and that democracy can only survive if Americans fight to defend it. The number of Americans barred from voting has doubled since 1880. Millions of dollars are being spent to limit voting, so your vote is definitely worth the fight. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been in the news a lot since the death of civil rights advocate John Lewis. It required states with a history of voter discrimination to obtain pre-clearance, which means permission, from the Justice Department before they could change any election laws. Note on this map that Virginia was one of the 9 states included in Section 5 of the '65 Voting Rights Act. We did, unfortunately, have a history of discrimination that included Jim Crow laws. Has our democracy been under attack since that Supreme Court decision in 2013? With each expansion of voting rights during our history, there have been corresponding new barriers. Since that court decision that removed pre-clearance, the gloves came off. Within weeks, 40 states introduced 200 different bills to make voting more difficult. Since 2013, 35 states now have strict ID laws. 17 million voters have been purged off registration lists, some for legitimate reasons such as death or moving. 1,688 polling places have been closed or consolidated since that Supreme Court decision, mostly in previously protected counties. In this year's primaries, more than 500,000 ballots were rejected. More than 500,000 ballots were rejected in 23 states, most due to lack of signatures or arriving past the deadline. The League is working at the federal and state levels to improve how elections are run. We fight for expanded opportunities to register and vote. An expected wave of evictions could affect voters expecting to receive their absentee ballots. And we send our condolences to our West Coast voters who recently lost their entire homes. I'm sure the absentee ballot is probably the least thing on their mind if that was burned. Remember those 1,688 closed polling places after pre-clearance was lifted from the southern states? With fewer polling places, long lines at polling locations became quite common. Moving them off college campuses or away from bus routes was a barrier to voters without cars. Voter registration itself can be a barrier to voting. 10 states make it hard to register. Local leagues have registered hundreds of thousands of voters in the last decades, yet as many as 1 in 3 eligible voters may not be registered. Voters of color, low-income voters, and young people are registered at lower rates. When our Constitution was ratified in 1787, there was no such thing as voter registration. Every state now except North Dakota requires it. Voter registration rates are much higher in other countries because the governments there identify the qualified voters. Laws regarding voter registration vary by state, as does purging voter registration lists. Virginia makes it easy to register online and may join the 22 states that allow same-day registration soon. The darker the orange, the more voters purged off lists. Note none in North Carolina, since you know now that they are the only state that does not require voters to be registered. The cross-check program did not find evidence of even one person who voted illegally. An August Pew Research Center survey found that voters are highly engaged, but that half of them expect to have difficulty voting. And they still predict that the turnout will be massive. That is a rallying call to voting rights organizations like the League. 83% of voters say that this election really matters. 6 in 10 expect to vote absentee. We'll now look at various other barriers to voting and how they developed. We will try to avoid that word suppression today since it arouses negative emotions more than the word barriers. There has been enough fear-mongering. Our goal today is to increase awareness of these barriers and understand the issue in all its complexities. Barriers to voting are not new. Discriminatory barriers to voting were enshrined by our founding fathers, who granted voting rights only to property-owning white males. And the Constitution they adopted gave the responsibility of election to the states. Women in New Jersey who were not married and could thus own property could vote for a few years. But most women had to fight until 1920 for suffrage. Voting rights for Black women and men were rare until 1965. Native Americans and Chinese Americans only a decade prior to that. To paraphrase a Paul Simon song, I'm not singing it, there really are 50 ways to leave your voter. Article 1 of the Constitution, known as the Election Clause, gave the responsibility of overseeing elections to states. Even election day varied by state up to the 1800s. States now have rules concerning public notices, voter registration, fraud prevention, vote counting, determination of election results. And the voting requirement in each state have changed throughout the years, especially for convicted felons who lose their right to vote, at least for a period of time, except in the two states of Maine and Vermont. Congress may pass federal laws regulating congressional elections that automatically preempt any contrary state statutes. As an example, Congress has exercised its power to make or alter rules concerning congressional elections by establishing a single national election day for congressional elections. And it has mandated that states divide themselves into congressional districts rather than electing all of their representatives at large. Congress has also enacted statutes limiting the amount of money that people may contribute to candidates for Congress, although there seem to be ways around that. They also require that people publicly disclose most election-related spending, mandating that voter registration forms be made available at various public offices, requiring states to ensure the accuracy of their voter registration rolls. 20 states now allow felons to vote after probation and parole are complete. But as I said, only Maine and Vermont never take away their right to vote. Barriers to the ballot box have existed for decades, but where there are barriers, there are voting rights advocates fighting against them. 55 years ago, they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama to end racial barriers to voting. Today, that fight continues throughout the country as voters face barriers like the ones on this slide. Our goal today is to raise awareness of these barriers and eliminate the needless and discriminatory barriers to voting before they happen. The fear factor, however, is alive and well in 2020, especially COVID-19, which has motivated many voters to apply for absentee ballots if they fear that the people in line with them on election day may not be wearing masks. Forward motion is the goal in football and in voting, but as mentioned earlier, after the 2013 Supreme Court removed those preclearances or permissions from the states, both the northern and southern states, many of them, have passed more restrictive barriers to voting. 200 different bills in 40 states to make it very difficult to vote. It's very telling. The still to be voted on by the Senate Voting Rights Act of 2019, now also called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, aims to negate these known discriminatory practices. Georgia is a prime example of barriers to voting, especially impacting voters of color. What happened in Georgia this year? One golden rule of elections officials is expect the unexpected. But those long lines at the Atlanta polling sites were an instant omen of voting breakdown in this pandemic-challenged election year. 8 states saw more than 5% of their voters wait at least half an hour to vote in 2016. Obvious solutions are to allocate sufficient resources, including poll workers, ballots, and voting equipment, to all polling places so that no voter waits more than 30 minutes in line. This is not just an issue of good government, but also of racial justice. Polling places in African American communities have far longer wait lines than polling places in white neighborhoods. It's not surprising that Georgia voters have very little confidence in elections. What happened in Georgia was a wake-up call to many. Inexperienced poll workers compounded the mistakes. 1.4 million voters had been purged, and many did not know it, showing up to vote. A record-breaking 1.5 million people responded to the invitation from the GOP Secretary of State to apply to vote by mail. Usually, only 40,000 people typically voted absentee in a Georgia primary. Georgia's new $107 million system failed to count some mail-in ballots that were marked with check marks like you see up there, or X's, instead of filling in the ovals. But standing in line should not require 8 hours to get an I voted sticker. More than 500,000 rejected ballots in our recent primaries. That far outnumbered the nearly 319,000 that were thrown out nationwide in 2016. That was only 1% of the roughly 33 million ballots cast that year. Many of those 500,000 never knew their votes were thrown out. But the fault lays not in our election system in that case, but in the voters themselves, who mailed ballots back too late or did not sign the envelope or marked with an X or a check mark. Virginia voters will see a ballot similar to this without Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln as presidential candidates, of course. So do fill in the oval, do not use a check mark, and do not put an X. Foreign interference is back in our headlines as well it should be. Russia, China, and Iran operatives are looking for open doors. To head that off, the Department of Homeland Security hired the RAND Corporation recently to reevaluate the nation's election vulnerabilities. They looked at poll booths to voter registration systems. They had this cleverly named Countering Truth Decay initiative to restore the role of facts and analysis in public life and the blurring of the line between opinion and fact. RAND's findings did not relieve our worries completely when they found that some state and local registration databases could be hacked by hackers. They could be locked, demanding ransomware, or manipulated by outside actors. States responded by patching the software vulnerability and backing up their systems. Good old-fashioned paper ballots are the best thing. They should reassure us in Virginia. However, 7 states will not have paper ballots or electronic machines that leave a paper trail. Virginia scanners, however, are not connected to the internet on Election Day. If you haven't seen the HBO documentary Kill Chain, The Cyber War on America's Election, please Google it and try to watch it. It's still available. It will keep you up at night. Don't worry about widespread voting online in the US, not for a long time. There's one platform called Ballot. It was used for internet voting in Delaware's recent primary, and to a smaller extent in West Virginia. But online voting raises too many severe risks. Only Estonia, the small country of Estonia, seems to have figured it out. And that's because all residents of Estonia have a digital ID. The main goal of disinformation is to discourage you from voting. Social networks are a breeding ground for disinformation and conspiracy theories. Facebook recently deactivated a small network of fake accounts associated with Russian operatives that had sowed disinformation during the 2016 election. And just a few days ago, Twitter announced that for the 6 weeks prior to Election Day, they will remove all tweets that attempt to undermine our faith in the electoral process with false claims about rigging or ballot tampering. I wish them luck. Foreign election interference dominates the discussion of disinformation, but much of the intentionally false content targeting US social media is generated by domestic sources. Anyone who has a computer and access to the internet can technically produce a deep fake video. The technology can be used to make people believe something is real when it's not. Facebook has also been cracking down on more than 1,200 so-called pink slime news sites that spread political messaging very disguised, looks very real. They use stock photos, but they are presenting themselves as local or business news publications, many under the umbrella of metric media. 19 of them are in Virginia with very believable names. Why do so many believe these alternative facts? Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for and interpret information that confirms what you already know and already believe. This webinar aims to correct some disinformation you may have heard and encourage you to confirm alarming news when you see it, especially on the internet. Check it out on Snopes or fact check. Learn how to spot it and avoid spreading it. Virginia placed second most difficult state in which to vote in a 2018 university study. Definitely not something to brag about. That was based on the time and effort it took to vote in recent presidential elections. Voter fraud is an accusation we hear a lot these days, and it's been used as an excuse to pass laws to suppress voting. This webinar will later address how fraud is virtually non-existent according to the most recent nonpartisan studies. Impersonation, for example, tarnishes approximately only one ballot out of every 32 million. Virginia's recent General Assembly session relaxed the most stringent of these suppression practices. As noted earlier, recent changes in this last special session will make voting easier in Virginia. No excuse absentee voting, 45 days prior to Election Day, good thing. No photo ID anymore. However, some ID is required. And Virginia is one of 22 states that will allow mail-in ballots that are postmarked by Election Day to be counted, as long as they are in by the Friday following. That's similar to IRS rules. It's not a sign of a rigged election. If you ordered, like I did, these beautiful new stamps that were just issued, you do not need one now on your absentee ballot. Supposedly, and I can't believe this, but I read it in a number of places, I didn't check it on Snopes though, less than half of young people under 35 have any idea how to actually vote by mail or where to buy stamps. Rural voters who do not have broadband may not be able to order stamps. Thus, Virginia legislators recently voted to provide absentee mail-in ballots, postage paid. Requiring photo IDs to vote was a new idea that got very popular around 2006. 17 states still hang on to it, but Virginia voters no longer need that photo ID. But you do need some form of valid ID. A Virginia driver's license, for example, even if expired, will suffice. Or a Virginia voter registration card, or a passport. A valid ID, a student ID, or any current utility bill or bank statement is fine too, if it includes your name and address. What is not acceptable? Out-of-state driver's licenses, obviously, or credit cards. The biggest change is that Virginia joined 17 other states that no longer require an excuse now to vote absentee. In the past, there were 19 acceptable reasons. Very recently, Alabama, Connecticut, Kentucky, New York, and West Virginia added fear of COVID-19 to the list of allowable excuses. These ballots will be counted. That is why we're being told to be patient on election night. Days may be needed to count them this year. Just a reminder that the League of Women Voters has been a voting rights organization for 100 years. We're proudly working in partnership with the Leadership Conference and other good government groups to inform voters about making their vote count. The League never supports or opposes candidates or parties, but we do advocate for voting rights. We heartily support early voting this year, either in person or by mail. Now I turn this webinar over to Sharon Allett, who will take you through more facts from other trusted sources about major barriers to voting. You will be a more informed voter, and we invite you to share this information with your friends and family members. Every vote must count in 2020. Sharon?
Thank you, Marianne. Voters can always use a refresher course, and there is quite a bit of voting minutia. The number one barrier is voters not knowing the latest election details, especially this year when they have been evolving. Only you should handle your ballot, and only you should return or mail it. If someone were to return a lot of ballots, that is called ballot harvesting. If you received an absentee ballot and then decide that you want to vote in person, do not vote twice. That is called a felony. Instead, take your unmarked ballot with you, and an election worker needs to void it. If you make a mistake, ask for another ballot. Under Virginia law, every precinct must have a polling station on election day. Consolidation needs special approval. If your polling place changes, voters must be notified. The last bullet on the slide is not well known. If you're sick at the last moment, do not go to the polls and spread your illness. Call your local elections office by 2 p.m. on the day before Election Day to request an emergency ballot. That is the only time that someone else serving as your representative can return your ballot. Provisional ballots are confusing to many people. If you show up without one of the acceptable forms of ID on the earlier slide, and know that you are registered in that precinct, request a provisional ballot. Then you must follow up in person at your local election office by noon on the Friday after Election Day. That date is November 6th this year. All of this is to say, check that your voter registration is up to date and check that you have proper ID, as provisional ballots are so much more work. Doubts raised about the U.S. Postal Service bring us to the second barrier to voting in 2020. That infamous letter to the 46 states got everyone's attention. That and the threat of a rigged election. The good news is that Virginia is one of 2 states with the longest early voting period in the country, 45 days. So Virginians have a lot of time to absentee vote by mail or drop off your completed ballot at your local elections office. But what about the loud threat of a rigged election due to mail-in ballots? About 195 million voters are now eligible to vote by mail, almost 80% of voters now, after a few more states changed their absentee voting laws since this slide was done only a few weeks ago. And some of those ballots will be on the way to voters who applied very soon. In Virginia, ballots will begin to be mailed after September 18th. Voting by mail is a process that involves several steps and more opportunity for error. They may be more likely to be rejected than those cast in person at polling locations. So please remember to sign the return ballot envelope, fill in those ovals completely, and return it as soon as possible. And now for some facts from other reliable sources. Here's what the Federal Election Commission chair says about the unfounded and non-existent allegations of widespread fraud. There is no basis that voting by mail causes fraud. The President's Election Integrity Commission was shut down in 2018 after a few months without producing any proof of voting abuse or millions of illegal votes. A scattered few instances of voter fraud do happen, some by voters who feared that their absentee ballot had not been received in time and then voted in person. Yet misinformation and disinformation persist. The Virginia Department of Elections just launched this Defending Democracy campaign to convey its commitment to election security. Note the center item that reminds us that Virginia voting machines are never connected to the internet on election day. Their slogan, "In Virginia, you can count on being counted," should reassure Virginia voters. Now, for a short math lesson. 25% of votes in 2016 and 2018 elections were cast by mail. If only 25% voted by mail this year, elections officials would be counting 1.4 million mail-in ballots. But they are anticipating 60%, not 25%. That number of mail-ins in Virginia alone would be 3.4 million. See why we will not have networks predicting winners on election night? If voter fraud were such a huge problem, why would the Department of Elections encourage voters to vote at home? Most reject the idea that voter fraud is a problem on a large, medium, or even small scale, and understand it is exceedingly rare, even in the states that implement mail voting 100%. The last Washington state absentee fraud case was in 2010, before they went to 100% vote by mail. Colorado had one absentee prosecution in 2012 and one in 2017, one before and one after they went to 100% mailed out ballots. And now we'll talk about the facts about voting by mail. Voting by mail is not new, as the U.S. Election Assistance Commission reminds us. It took place during the Civil War and in subsequent wars, and 500,000 military families depend on it. Every state allows some form of mail-in ballots, and 5 have used that method as their primary way of voting for 5 years. 5 more states, including Vermont, Nevada, and New Jersey, states with both Democratic and Republican governors and secretaries of state, just joined them in 2020. Voter impersonation is rare, less likely than being struck by lightning, says the Brennan Center for Justice. Every step of the vote by mail process includes security procedures to ensure the voter requesting the ballot is the voter receiving and voting the ballot. Many states use various signature matching methods or require witnesses. Virginia has just removed the witness requirement for mail-in ballots in 2020 due to COVID-19. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission stresses how both parties have put in safeguards to control who delivers and who picks up ballots. Mailed ballots typically are delivered to and picked up from the post office by 2 election office staff, transported in a secure container and processed by trained election staff. Ballot tracking barcodes allow voters and election officials to track their ballots, especially handy when a voter claims to not have received their absentee ballot. We will give you the website to do this at the end of the presentation. Only 372 possible cases of double voting were found out of 14.6 million mail-in votes in the last 2 elections. That equates to 0.0025%. In Georgia last week, election officials announced that they are investigating potentially 1,000 cases of double voting in their June primary and August runoff. It did not affect the outcome of those elections, but the investigation will determine if the voters deliberately voted twice to test the integrity of the system, or were unsure that their absentee ballots would not be received in time and voted again. In states where all or most voters receive ballots by mail, many voters do not mail completed ballots. Rather, they opt to drop their ballots off at secured drop boxes. These come in different forms. The recent Virginia special session allowed lock boxes, but there may not be one in your area. James City County does have a satellite absentee voting location at the James City County Rec Center on Ironbound Road. The Virginia Department of Elections is required to coordinate annual post-election audits of ballot scanner machines to identify any irregularities. Paper ballots in Virginia ensure that the number of votes cast in the scanner, for instance, do not exceed the number of paper ballots. In 2018, officials found a major discrepancy that revealed a GOP campaign official in North Carolina had harvested absentee ballots. Harsh penalties, such as 3 to 5 years in prison or $10,000 in fines, should be strong deterrents to voter fraud. Seriously, all that for one more vote? It doesn't seem worth it. Some believe that voting by mail improves outcomes for Democrats, but that is not true if you look at past elections. Mail-in ballots in Florida helped elect Republican President George W. Bush in 2000, and many red states have expanded vote by mail in recent years. And even in blue states, vote by mail has helped the GOP. A recent study confirmed that voting by mail does not favor one party over another. Our new normal, again, applies to election night too. Counting absentee ballots will take additional time this year. We may not know election results for some time. Some are already calling it election week or possibly election month. That does not equate to a rigged election. Democracy is not a spectator sport, so do not expect election results on election night in 2020. Here's a sample James City County ballot. Note that you are voting for electors and that there are 3 candidates for president. If you are in Congressional District 2, there are also 3 candidates for that district. Remember to turn the ballot over and vote on the 2 constitutional amendments. The first one addresses partisan gerrymandered voting districts by establishing a bipartisan independent redistricting commission. Learn more about gerrymandering before you see amendment number 1 on your ballot. 2020 is the last opportunity to approve redistricting reforms before election maps are drawn next year after the census results. This topic deserves its own separate webinar, but this chart is very informative. If you look at the figures on the right, the figure on the far left indicates election results of 60% blue and 40% red. Yet the funky gerrymander drawing on the right, far right, shows how clever legislators can manipulate the lines to result in 3 red and 2 blue districts. Gerrymandering is definitely a barrier to fair voting and representation. This particular goofy kicking Donald Duck gerrymandered congressional district in Pennsylvania always gets a laugh. Having a memorable phrase got results, and this bizarrely drawn district was redrawn. Voters are demanding changes. In 2018, Utah, Colorado, Missouri, and Michigan passed ballot initiatives to stop gerrymandering. And now it is Virginia's chance. Voters should be able to pick their elected officials and not the other way around. A yes vote on amendment number 1 will give the power of drawing legislative district lines to an independent and bipartisan commission with citizen members and an equal number from both major political parties. Yes, both parties have been guilty of gerrymandering, but this map is quite clear. Maryland is the only blue state that is guilty. What can you do to safeguard this coming election and make every vote count? Share what you have learned today with family and friends. Do not let friends collect and return absentee ballots other than their own. Do not believe and hit share on everything you read or hear without checking for its accuracy. Make a voting plan whether you choose to vote in person or absentee. Vote early and be patient waiting for election results. Do not waste your absentee vote by forgetting to sign the ballot envelope and adding the information requested. Remind friends that polls are open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. You will be allowed to vote if you are in line at your precinct by 7 p.m. Do not get out of line. Learn more about all your candidates. The League has a candidate forum, or at the very least, a meet and greet on October 8th at 7 p.m. More information is coming soon. The Vote 111 website from the League of Women Voters expects 10 million viewers seeking nonpartisan information on both general and state-specific information on many aspects of the election process, absentee ballot information, election dates, polling place locations, registration deadlines, voter qualifications, and more. Tell friends about the Virginia Department of Elections handy citizen portal tool where they can easily register to vote, update their address so it matches their driver's license, apply for an absentee ballot, and track where that ballot is. Share with friends and family what Susan B. Anthony said, even though she never got to vote. Don't waste your vote. Somebody, actually lots of someone's, struggled for your right to vote. Use it. And now a more current 58-second testimonial from today's voters.
They tried to silence me.
They tried to block me. They tried to deny me.
To scare me.
To scare me. They tried to erase me. To erase me.
Erase me.
They tried to keep me down.
Keep me down.
Keep me down.
They tried to make me invisible. They tried to pretend I don't matter.
Pretend my people don't matter.
My people don't matter.
They tried to kill me.
Kill me. Kill me. They tried to suppress me. Suppress me. They tried to block me. They tried to suppress me. They tried to deny me.
And still.
And still. And still.
And still, I vote.
I vote. Todavía voy a votar.
And still, I vote.
I vote.
And still, I vote.
And still, I